Oh, come in. Hi, come away and have a seat. Oh, dear, right. Well, work proceeds apace on the great move. But as I've been sharing with you, one of the kind of nice things, although I have to say it delays me, is that I keep coming across things that we've tucked away somewhere, which we now have to make a decision about keeping or losing. And I found something I'm definitely keeping, but I tucked it away. And I'll just turn the light up. This is a lovely Peterson Sherlock Holmes Squire, which I recently got. Has this lovely diamond shank. Anyway, what I want to show you is this. Take a look at this. All in its nice little silver band. R3. 3 orders of service covering the major services during the reinterment of King Richard III in Leicester Cathedral between the 22nd of March and the 27th of March 2015. Now, let's take the little band off. And there's a service of reveal, which is the one that I'll tell you the story about shortly. The reveal of the tomb, amazing tomb. A reveal of the tomb and celebration for King Richard III by the grace of God, King of England and France and Lord of Ireland. That took place on 27th of March. And then there's the service of Compline for the reception of the remains of King Richard III. And then there's the service of reinterment for the remains. Anyway, have a seat. So there's a nice little forward here from the Dean of Leicester, beginning and telling us the famous story. Who would have believed a king would be found in a car park? It took much ingenuity to find and identify King Richard III. The advocacy and research of the Richard III Society, combined with the passion and commitment of the Looking for Richard project, alongside the expertise and care of the University of Leicester, led to his finding. King Richard III was a courageous soldier, a disabled person at a time very different to ours, a brother, husband and father who knew personal tragedy. His life, so often retold by Shakespeare and the victors of Bosworth, places him at a pivot of our history and resolutely within the culture of England. He seems a hero to some and a villain to others. In the few short years of his reign held promise of a time of peace and good government that was not to be. His finding returns him to the entire nation. He does not belong to one viewpoint or to one geographical place. His story has more to reveal. And it says here as well, in fact, this is a message from Queen Elizabeth herself. The reinterment of King Richard III is an event of great national and international significance. Today we recognise a king who lived through turbulent times and whose Christian faith sustained him in life and death. Well, it was dramatic. It was extraordinary when they discovered the body, and suddenly we had this service in the cathedral that was going to be the reinterment of one of the great kings, whichever way you look at him, of England. Now, you might reasonably say, why have I got these? Well, thereby hangs a tale. Some years ago, must have been towards the end of 2014, or maybe the very beginning of 2015, I received an unexpected email from the Dean of Leicester, which said, Rex Gentium Confidential. Rex Gentium, of course, is King of the Nations, and I thought, I've no idea what this is. Anyway, all preparations were beginning for these services, all entirely hush-hush, they were going to just reveal it all on the day. And the email was to say that, as they were thinking about crafting these orders of service, for what they call the reveal of the tomb, the first service in which, before the remains were brought, they were going to show the beautiful stone monument in Yorkshire, stone that was going to be his resting place. They had a whole service about that, and of course it was about what it is to remember about stones, about cutting, but it was also about the flawed and tragic history of the king himself. but also trying to bring out that, notwithstanding his sins, when we're all sinners, he was also a person of faith who looked for salvation. Anyway, rather to my surprise, the Dean and others preparing the service, looking for poetry that they might want to use in it, had read my sonnet in a series of sonnets on the Advent antiphons that had been published in my book, Sounding the Seasons, about 3 years earlier. And they felt that my sonnet, which of course is a sonnet about Christ as king, but it's also a sonnet that reflects on brokenness and kingship and welcome and rejection, because that's what the original Advent antiphon is about, the king, the king of the nations, the cornerstone who's been rejected. They just felt that my poem might be appropriate. So I wrote back and said, well, my poem is about Christ, it's not about Richard III. I wouldn't want to ascribe to Richard III something that I wanted to ascribe to Christ. And they said, no, that's not what we're going to do. The context of the poem will be very clear, that we're burying him as a king and as a flawed man, but we're burying him in the name of Christ, who is all of our kings and is the king of the commoner as well as the king, and before whom, of course, we're equal. Anyway, I was reassured that there was going to be a proper use of this poem, so I said yes. And I found it rather extraordinary that here was I in the 21st century, but somebody with a love of medieval things, and of course knowing the stories through Shakespeare and other sources, and I'd visited Bosworth, that I would suddenly find myself quite literally like a medieval poet, that I was a poet whose poems would honour the obsequies, as it were, of a medieval king, and also in that sense briefly a poet of the court, in the sense that my poem would be printed in and read from an order of service which was introduced by the Queen. So it was a frankly extraordinary thing. So I thought, well, this is going to be good, and I think plan A had been that I would read the poem, which would have been absolutely wonderful. But it turned out that I couldn't get out of this, that I was scheduled to be in America giving some lectures and readings at the time of the service. So although I have, and these would only be possessed, there are very few of these producers, these were only given to the people who were invited to attend this service. Although I didn't attend it, I got these anyway, and in fact I was able to nominate somebody, and Maggie went and was there, and my poem was actually read by the Canon Hazel Baroness Byford, who was the chair of the Cathedral Council. And so suddenly, as we were packing and thinking about getting things in boxes, this little trove emerged, and I thought, well, this is something I'm definitely going to keep and pass on to the children and grandchildren, my brief moment as a royal poet. So I thought you might be interested to hear the poem. And this was done, as it were, at the point where the carved stone of the monument was revealed. So all remain seated as Canon Hazel Baroness Byford, DBE, DL, Chairman of Leicester Cathedral Council, reads O Rex Gentium. So you have to imagine that I'm there. But I would have been me reading it had my diary not been otherwise. And as I say, this is a sonnet in a sequence of sonnets addressed to Christ. But when I got the email, and of course I immediately went and reread the sonnet, I could see why they chose it. I could see how certain lines of mine, though not intended for this occasion, clearly, I mean, nobody knew that Richard III's body was going to be rediscovered. Parts of my sonnet, though not intended for this occasion, had a fullness of application to this occasion. And of course, that's the nature of poetry. It always means more than the poet himself means. It always carries this great treasury of meaning, which it releases at various points in its life, which is hopefully longer than the life of the poet who writes it. But this was a real example of a poem becoming a new thing, even in the poet's lifetime. So here is O Rex Gentium. O King of our desire, whom we despise, King of the nations, never on the throne, unfound foundation, cast off cornerstone, rejected joiner, making many one, you have no form or beauty for our eyes. a king who comes to give away his crown, a king within our rags of flesh and bone. We pierce the flesh that pierces our disguise, for we ourselves are found in you alone. Come to us now, and find in us your throne, O King, within the child, within the clay, O hidden King who shapes us in the play of all creation, shapes us for the day your coming kingdom comes into its own. And I felt a great kind of poignancy and bathos, as well as astonishment, to think of this poem being read on this occasion. You can see how some of the lines which are about the idea that Christ was rejected and that Christ, according to the prophecy of Isaiah, had no form or beauty for our eyes. Rejected, joiner, making many when you have no form or beauty for our eyes. That does link in a kind of oblique way with the tradition that Richard III was disabled, that he had a hunchback, that he had been had a kind of cloak of malice almost cast on him by others simply because he was quote unquote deformed, and that may have affected the development of his character. But of course that line in my poem is immediately followed by a line about Christ, a king who comes to give away his crown, that Christ comes to share his sovereignty. Christ comes not as a king who lords it above us, but a king who serves us as a servant, and that, there is the crown of thorns before there's the crown of gold. Of course, the crown, famously in Shakespeare, goes from Richard and hangs upon a thorn tree in Bosworth Field. A horse, my kingdom for a horse. So, in that sense, Richard is the opposite, that Richard was unleashing violence in order to seize and retain the crown, and was in that sense a sinner, and like all of us, somebody who vainly grasps for power when the kingdom and the power and the glory really belong to Christ. But at the same time, that same Christ has mercy on us all and comes to redeem us and shape us in the play of all creation for the day the coming kingdom comes into its own. So my poem, in a sense, was in one sense given to the nation. It became part of this national event. But in another sense, it was given back to me in a kind of new form and in a new way. And this new context. I was just thrilled to be, at least vicariously and through my words, part of this historic occasion. And it's a story that I shall keep in my heart and occasionally, as I am with you, take out and tell, just for the extraordinary and unexpected poignancy of it. Anyway, lovely to see you. Thanks for dropping by.